I'm not the first person, of course, to have suspected that there's a very significant difference between ancient skepticism, ancient Greek skepticism, and modern post-Cartesian skepticism. I begin with a quotation from a philosopher that perhaps not everybody in the room has read with great attention, Hegel, who writes in his lectures on the history of philosophy, "The older skepticism must be distinguished from the modern, and the former alone is of a true, profound nature. Modern skeptics make it fundamental that we must consider sensuous being, what is given to sensuous consciousness, to be true. All else must be doubted. Modern skepticism is the subjectivity and vanity of consciousness, which is undoubtedly invincible, not however to science and truth, but merely to itself, this subjectivity." And I think that this remark is profoundly correct, and I hope to defend this claim tonight. In the course of it, I'll be giving what is, in fact, I think, a quite controversial account of the nature of ancient skepticism, particularly Pyrrhonian skepticism. As far as I know, I'm the only person who accepts it, and quite possibly the only person who's even heard of it. But that's because most people who take ancient skepticism seriously are classical scholars, which I am not, and I read the Textus particularly with the eye of an epistemologist, and not with the eye of a scholar. And then I'll have something to say about Cartesian skepticism, which is owes a good deal to my teacher, the late Richard Rorty, but will put a somewhat different spin perhaps on it than he did. Well, many philosophers have been aware, particularly since the groundbreaking work of Miles Bernier, that the skeptical problem, which perhaps has and still does lie at the heart of modern discussions of philosophical skepticism, the problem of our knowledge of the external world, was not formulated, or certainly not formulated in full generality, by the ancient skeptics. Even though the ancient skeptical tradition from Pyrrho, a younger contemporary of Aristotle, into the Hellenistic period of late antiquity ran for the best part of 700 years. You might wonder, why is it they didn't get around to formulating this? Of course, the modern problem of our knowledge of the external world which is rather I think rather special. It's long since escaped. In Descartes, as we'll be discussing later, of course, it's dramatized by means of a quasi-theological speculation, the idea of a malin génie, an evil deceiver who manipulates Descartes' perceptual experience, so that it appears to Descartes as if he's in a material world, perhaps lecturing on why he's not being deceived by a malin génie or something of the sort like this, interacting with objects around him, when in fact his life is, in a funny sense, something like a long experience of a merely virtual reality, an uninterrupted dream, wholly delusional. This problem, of course, has long since escaped the boundaries of professional philosophy. I mean, it's often given as an introductory to philosophy courses, but it's long since escaped the boundary of the classroom, and it shows up in popular films these days, like The Matrix. I mean, no doubt the rise of virtual reality technology has allowed us to some degree to de-theologize the problem and give it a certain high-tech gloss, which no doubt makes it even more appealing to the undergraduates. I think it's important to realize that one way in which this differs from any problem considered by the ancients is that, of course, the problem is not really the skepticism is not really essential. That's to say, it's not really skepticism about our capacity to know the real nature of things in the world around us. It's existential. I mean, there's a question of, is there an external world at all that is at least remotely like what we normally consider the external world to be like? Is it, say, for example, in any sense, a material world? Perhaps not. And perhaps in that sense, Descartes' malin génie is even more profound than the technological version, because after all, the evil deceiver presumably gets to do his evil deceiving without wires, computers, or any particular piece of hardware. Well, why is it that the ancients didn't get around to formulating this problem? There's, I think, a prima facie plausible answer, and surely it's part of the truth, an answer to some degree favoured by Miles Bernier himself. And this answer calls attention to the essentially practical nature of ancient skepticism. I mean, one might say, following the great French historian of philosophy, Pierre Hadot, the teacher of Michel Foucault, actually, that all Greek philosophy is, in a sense, practical, in the sense that it's ultimately ethically oriented. It's, the aim of all philosophy is, as it were, to show us how to live in the world. Of course, the aim of standard philosophy is to show us how to live in the world, given that the world and we ourselves are certain ways. So to, I mean, you know, to tell us about nature so that we can live according to nature, the nature of the world and the nature of ourselves. Skepticism, however, of course, is precisely in this sense the anti-philosophy philosophy. It's the way to live without getting involved with questions like that. But nevertheless, of course, the ultimate aim is that it's a way of life, to describe a way of life, and it seems natural to say that a philosophy which is ultimately intended to present a way of living in the world is hardly likely to extend itself to doubting the existence of the world. I mean, it might very well incorporate, and indeed will incorporate, a certain measure of what I call essential skepticism. Of course, the skeptic will not make claims to know the real nature of things, but he'll hardly doubt that there are things to be coped with. He's describing a way of coping with them, however, which doesn't depend upon knowledge of what at least philosophers think of as their real nature. By contrast, Descartes, and this is of course the significance of his calling his work Meditations, constructs his skeptical thought experiments and develops his skeptical arguments in the context of a purely theoretical inquiry. Descartes, after all, uses skepticism methodologically as a kind of filter for certainty. Push skeptical arguments as far as they can go and see how and where they break down. But for the purpose of this project, all practical considerations have been set aside, and so the argument goes, Descartes can push his skeptical doubts farther than it would have made sense to the ancient skeptics to push them. Well, I don't say that can't be wholly wrong, but I'm certain it's not the whole story. And after all, I think in fact it underestimates the difference between skepticism, particularly ancient Pyrrhonian skepticism, and skepticism we know it in the modern period after Descartes. And for one thing, it's not just the problem of the external world that's missing from the ancient skeptics. The whole panoply of modern problems of epistemology, the problem of other minds, the problem of induction, Bertrand Russell's skeptical problem about knowledge of the past, those are missing too. Ancient Pyrrhonian skepticism simply is not organized around problems of that character. But anyway, on the handout, I think I have a list of just, by no means exhaustive, of some of the differences. First of all, Pyrrhonism, we see, has a sustained skeptical outcome. Not doubt, but something called suspension of judgment. Pyrrhonism actually begins in doubt and ends in suspension of judgment. I'll say something about that in a moment. Secondly, Pyrrhonism is highly discursive. I mean, Sextus notoriously writes books raising, so to say, first-order problems for all the special sciences of his day. He writes against the mathematicians, against the physicists, against the grammarians, and generally against the professors. It seems in some way closely rooted in or connected to genuine disagreements that people have. The learned people, at least, of his day. By contrast, Cartesian skepticism, Pyrrhonian skepticism, includes what we would recognize as general skeptical arguments, for sure, but it is certainly not confined to them. By contrast, Cartesian skepticism is wholly dependent on fully general skeptical arguments, and has nothing to do with actual disagreements. I mean, On the contrary, it trades in outrageous skeptical hypotheses. It's not as if anyone actually believes he or she might be dreaming all the time, or is inclined to think that he or she might be the victim of the evil deceiver, or trapped as a victim of the supercomputer in the Matrix. If anyone were inclined to believe that, I would be far more inclined to recommend medication over education. I mean, it doesn't... It's one of those things that if any man claimed to believe this, it is fruitless to argue him out of it. I mean, to adapt the saying of Hume. So there's another point of contrast. Even in its epistemological component, it seems to me, Pyrrhonism is skeptical. I mean, rather than dogmatic. I mean, Descartes does, at least temporarily, attempt to reach skeptical conclusions. But Sextus seems to, although he deploys skeptical arguments, if you read Sextus, seems oddly resistant to or reluctant to draw a definitive skeptical conclusion from them. They're there, but it's not clear what they're there for. In the fourth place, it seems to me that Pyrrhonian suspension of judgment is, as I like to put it, flat. It's sort of all the same, and thus we suspend judgment, says Sextus. Whereas everyone who reads the first meditation has a sense of stratification. The original doubts are rather shallow. The ordinary perceptual misleading appearances or ordinary perceptual illusions, the round tower that looks square. The dreaming argument seems to probe a bit deeper and to take in perhaps all sort of everyday knowledge of particular things in our immediate environment. And then the deceiver argument is initially introduced to go deeper still and perhaps to bring in mathematics, at least insofar as it's still thought to have some connection with the more abstract features of material existence. So you think the doubt is, as it were, going deeper and somehow then expanding and taking more and more things in. It's in a way ordering our convictions in a certain kind of order of epistemic priority according to how difficult they are to doubt. And indeed Descartes will in fact reinstate many of these convictions in precisely the reversed order, with the most difficult things to doubt proving in the end to lie at the foundations of knowledge, when properly understood. There's no sense of stratification like that. And that's to do, I think, with the fifth thing. The epistemological core of Pyrrhonism is the Agrippan trilemma, or the regress problem. The thought that if you put forward a proposition as something that you know, it's perfectly reasonable for the skeptic to ask how you know it. And then when you after all, you're the one making the claim to have more than a mere opinion, and then when you say something, the skeptic says, well, is that something you know, or just another of your opinions? And then, if you're not careful, whatever you say, the question will be reiterated, and an infinite regress seems to loom. And at some point, then it seems only one of three awful things can happen. Either you go on forever thinking of new things to say, trapped in a regress, or eventually at some point you tell the skeptic to get lost, at which point he says you're simply making an assumption, why didn't you make one to begin with and save me all the trouble? Or you end up inadvertently repeating something you've already said, and the skeptic says you're going round in circle, a paradigmatically bad form of reasoning. Now, Descartes does confront that problem later in the Meditations. It's the notorious problem of the Cartesian circle. But the problem of the first Meditations doesn't work that way at all. It turns on what we might call indistinguishability arguments. How can you tell you're not dreaming right now? Or how can you tell that you're not the victim of the evil deceiver or the supercomputer? Wouldn't things look just the same either way? So this is a very different form of skeptical argument from the regress problem, and lies at the base of Cartesian skepticism. I believe that the historical source of indistinguishability arguments is in fact academic, not Pyrrhonian skepticism. But even then, as I hope to argue later on, the resemblances between Descartes' use of such considerations as dreaming and divine deception are only superficially similar to the use of them made by the academics, at least as reported in Cicero's Academica. So I want to conclude then, or at least proleptically suggest, that Cartesian skepticism does not originate by pushing old considerations farther, because, as it were, the practical limitations have been removed. It actually involves new considerations. So what I'm going to argue is that Cartesian and Pyrrhonian skepticism, and indeed academic skepticism, differ not only in aim, but in what I'm going to call structure and content. Well, to explain this a little more, let me briefly introduce some analytic apparatus which I deploy in the manuscript on which I'm working. And the key idea I have is the idea of a skeptical stance. I like the word stance. Notice stance is not a doctrine, it's a stance, it's an attitude, it's a practical and or theoretical orientation. Skeptical stances, I believe, can be analyzed into two principal elements which I call doctrinal and suspensive. A doctrinal element is what it says, it's an epistemic doctrine. Perhaps the doctrine that we have no knowledge, or that everything that we accept is mere opinion, something like that. I'm not concerned right now what the doctrine is. That's a doctrinal component. And then there's a suspensive component. The suspensive component involves giving something up. The Pyrrhonian skeptic suspends judgment, by which he seems to mean get by without beliefs altogether. We'll come back to that. But there's other possibilities. Hume says that psychologically it's impossible to extirpate one's natural beliefs. But it is possible to start not treating them as if they're, as it were, ultimately defensible or something like that. So even the Humean skeptic might be thought to give something up. He doesn't give up his everyday beliefs, but he does, as it were, have a somewhat different attitude towards them than he had pre-theoretically. Hume thinks, in fact, that exposure to extreme skepticism leads to a kind of epistemic modesty, a tendency not to claim too much for yourself in matters of knowledge and certainty. So that's a kind of suspensive element. Even Cartesian skepticism is suspensive, as we'll see. It's only temporarily suspensive, but it's suspensive. That's the point of methodological skepticism. You try to see how far you can actually just stop yourself from accepting things you normally accept, and see where this project logically breaks down, so to say, and not merely psychologically. I'd like to note, moving to 3, though, the doctrinal element, this is quite important, can be modally weak or modally strong. You might say that, by modally weak I mean, you might just say, in fact, we don't know anything. That leaves open the possibility that by trying harder, rolling up our sleeves and concentrating a bit more, we might actually get around to knowing something. Or, more typically, skepticism is modally strong. It says knowledge is impossible. There's some principled, as it were, objection to the very aspiration to knowledge which the skeptic exploits. And then I said that the principal elements are doctrinal and suspensive. There's a secondary element. I call it secondary because I think it doesn't appear in all versions of skepticism. I call it, following my former colleague Robert Fogelin, prescriptive skepticism. It's just a skeptical prescription. It says you shouldn't do something or another. You shouldn't claim to be knowledgeable, or you shouldn't claim to be able to justify your beliefs. You shouldn't claim to have more than mere opinion. That's the first thing. That's the element of a skeptical stance. We can also look at the extent. In other words, what does the skeptic take his skeptical stance towards? How extensive is his skepticism, doctrinal or suspensive? And notice, they needn't be the same. They aren't in the case of Hume, perhaps. But this, I think, needs to be analysed a little more precisely than people who write about these matters typically do. I think we should distinguish the skeptic's epistemic target. What propositional attitude, what's he talking about here? Knowing that P? Being justified in accepting that P? Believing that P, period? These are all different. And I think sometimes rather crude presentations of the difference between ancient and modern skepticism in terms of the practicality of one and the high theoreticity of the other, actually, which is then often put in terms of the one targeting knowledge and the other targeting belief, actually confuses the distinction between the aim of skepticism and the practical and the epistemic target of skepticism. After all, both doctrinal and suspensive skepticism can differ in epistemic target. I mean, belief could be your epistemic target. I think it's the primary target for the Pyrrhonian skepticism, and knowledge is a secondary target, still. But anyway, they're not the same thing. To say one targets knowledge and the other targets belief is not the same as to say the one is suspensive and the other is doctrinal. If that's if that was the claim, that's simply not true, it seems to me. Then we might look at the topical range. I mean, what particular judgments or propositions does the skeptic get in his sights? Everything? Universal skepticism? Skepticism about the external world, perhaps. It's not universal. There might be things that the external world isn't skeptical about at all. Pure mathematics, perhaps. And then finally, there's the issue of contextual scope. I mean, when does the skeptic take up his skeptical stance, or which version of skeptical stance does he take up when? To what extent does the Pyrrhonian skeptic carry skepticism into everyday life? To what extent does the Cartesian? Not at all. But notice, I mean, to say that I mean, that's another way in which this simple theoretical practical distinction doesn't do anything for us. After all, Descartes' skepticism is perfectly suspensive, but it's just contextually limited. It's suspensive within the context, the initial stages of the project of pure inquiry. It doesn't mean that it's not suspensive, it's just suspensive in a special context. Even Hume is a suspensive skeptic in the study when he suffers these periodic skeptical breakdowns. He's just not, so to say, a sustained or consistent suspensive skeptic. He doesn't think anyone can be. Well, I won't go on too much about this, but I think this analytical apparatus is very useful for exploring different forms that skepticism has taken historically. And some of the simple knowledge versus belief, practical versus theory, just don't do it. And they radically underestimate the range of options in the skeptical tradition, many of which have been occupied, by the way, or taken up by one skeptic or another. But I want to move on to the third thing now. With this apparatus in mind, I can introduce what I call the standard model. And the standard model goes roughly like this. Doctrinal skepticism plus an epistemic prescription entail prescriptive skepticism, leading where possible to suspensive skepticism. So the skeptics, and in typical form, I think, the epistemic target of doctrinal epistemic skepticism is some high-value epistemic state, like knowledge or justification. The epistemic prescription is typically a doxastic norm, saying what you are and are not entitled to believe, leading to prescriptive doxastic skepticism, inducing, again where possible, suspensive doxastic skepticism. So, this, roughly speaking, the skeptic argues nothing you accept can really be rationally justified. That would be the doctrine. You shouldn't accept things that you can't rationally justify. W.K. Clifford, right? It's improper, always, everywhere, and for everyone to believe things upon insufficient evidence, said Clifford. So that would be a doxastic norm. So, if the skeptic is right in his doctrine, you shouldn't believe anything at all. There's the prescription. So far as you can get away with it, you don't. That would be the standard model. Now, I call it the standard model because I think virtually all skeptical stances that we know post-Descartes conform to this model. The problem with the model, I think, is that it's had an incredibly distorting effect on people's reading of the ancient skeptics. Because my first claim is that the Pyrrhonians don't. The Pyrrhonian stance is not like that. The Pyrrhonian stance is non-standard. So let me say something about that. I said about the standard strategy. I'll come back to that. Epistemic goal plus method plus obstacle entails skeptical thesis. That's how you get to the doctrinal skepticism. That's of course the key move in the standard model. You set a goal. You explain how we're supposed to get there if we can. You then find something that stands in the way of getting there, and then that gives you the doctrinal skepticism that you need. Okay, well look, if we look at Descartes for a minute, anyone who's read the first meditation, I think, can see that Descartes' skeptical stance is a paradigm of the standard model in its typical form. Here's just a few brief quotes from Descartes. His epistemic goal, he says, is certain knowledge, to establish, quote, something firm and lasting in the sciences. And this turns out to be a kind of absolute certainty, as all readers of Descartes will know. Now, of course, Descartes is trying to defend his highly rationalistic conception of knowledge against a certain kind of naive empiricism which he attributes to common sense and in fact associates with Aristotelian scholasticism. Come back to that later. But he says in the past his beliefs have come from the senses or through the senses. Pretty vague, that, as a matter of fact. And that's another point that we'll go back to. But at least the thought is, so the question is, immediately, given this goal and this method, are the senses a source of certainty? And then Descartes takes us through a sequence of obstacles. Everyday perceptual errors, well, they do seem to possibly detract from absolute certainty, but not so clearly, because they can be fixed. I mean, the round tower may appear square from a distance, so go and look closer, and then you'll get it right. The dreaming argument, a little more complicated. I mean, after all, there's no question of being far away, but Descartes seems to think anything that I can see, or think I see, I can potentially dream. Here I am, he says, sitting in my stove, my little hut, in my dressing gown with a book on my lap, but then I think, wait a minute, haven't I dreamt? Aren't I a person who dreams? Could I dream this? Anything I can experience? Surely I can dream. And then finally the evil deceiver that we talked about. So three increasingly severe obstacles to getting to the goal via the method. Doxastic norm, reason now leads me to think that I should hold back my assent from those opinions which are not completely certain and indubitable, just as carefully as I do from those which are patently false. So there you go. Suspensive doxastic skepticism, difficult, says Descartes, but at least temporarily and in the context of pure inquiry, not impossible. Anyway, we're not talking about psychological inclination to believe. Even though I may find those difficult to suppress, I could certainly, so to say, not rely on any of my common sense convictions in any inferences going forward until I give them better credentials than they have at the end of the first meditation. So in that sense, in the context of this inquiry, and given how assent is induced in the context of this inquiry, suspension is perfectly possible and will indeed be followed in a systematic way. So that's pure standard model stuff. Sextus, seems to me, works completely differently. Pyrrhonian skepticism, at least in my reading of it, is not just practically oriented or practically intended, it's practical all the way down. What do I mean by that? Well, I simply take seriously the very first thing Sextus tells us about his methods and his aims and everything. Sextus says that skeptics are made, as it were, from disappointed philosophers. He says men of talent, perturbed by the contradictions in things, wanted to find out what was true, but then they find out, he tells us, that the more they look into matters, the more they find conflicting opinions, the more they find plausible ways of arguing on different sides of any question. And so, insensibly, they are brought to a general suspension of judgment on these matters. So, it's call this the method of opposition. The idea is to put yourself in the position of Buridan's ass, the famous donkey caught between the two bales of hay or the two carrots or whatever, and simply unable to move towards one or the other. Now here I think Jonathan Barnes is absolutely right, though, when he says that it's a conceptual. Sextus often calls this orchestrating of conflicting judgments or conflicting appearances or conflicting judgments and appearances, mix and match. Says that of equal strength, isostheneia, that of equal strength. I think Jonathan Barnes is absolutely right, though, when he says that to say that, as it were, these are an opposition of equal strength that involves poles of equal strength leads to the suspension of judgment is a conceptual truth. I mean, it's not that there's an independent criterion for equal strengths, so that we can then wonder, will we suspend judgment if we meet that criterion? It's if we find ourselves paralyzed in that way, then the conflict involved equivalent poles, involved isostheneia. So, as I like to put it, this ability to orchestrate oppositions is, so to say, criterion independent and prescription free. It doesn't involve an epistemic method or criterion of knowledge. It doesn't involve any element of epistemic prescription, both of which are integral to standard model skepticism. You simply get there by the orchestration of these oppositions. Now, as a result of this, the doctrinal element in Pyrrhonian skepticism is ex post facto and modally weak. Sextus doesn't actually discuss what he calls the skeptical slogans until long after his presentation of the skeptic's method of argument has been presented. And then the slogans are presented in various ways, but the most important way he presents them is they're essentially progress reports. My method hasn't let me down so far as I can tell. I've practiced this, and I've not really been able to make up my mind on these issues that philosophers go on about. And by the way, that would even include common sense convictions elevated to the rank of, so to say, objects of philosophical examination. I think it's very important that common sense is not common sense thematized. I'll come back to that in a second. Now, of course, the reason everybody, what I've said so far is absolutely, well, maybe not absolutely familiar. Actually, as a matter of fact, if you just look at the New Anderson Barnes or translation of Sextus, Sextus says, my Greek was A, never much, and B, even less than it used to be, but as I read Sextus says that the basis of skepticism is the putting into opposition of propositions, of judgments and appearances, blah, 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 so as to introduce. The Anderson Barnes translation says the basis of skepticism is the claim that judgments and appearances can be put into oppositions. It's very different. I mean, there's nothing in the Greek that says the claim that. I mean, Sextus is pretty damn clear that it's the ability to orchestrate the opposition, not any kind of claim about an ability to orchestrate. Anybody can claim. It's like, this is where your claim falls to the ground, right? When you can't actually do it. I mean, you've got to be able to do it. And if I'm right, you don't need any epistemology to do it. But okay, but with that aside, I mean, nobody really disputes, I think, what I've just said. The reason they don't think it's much of an account of Pyrrhonism is because the outlines of Pyrrhonism is full of general skeptical arguments, the famous modes of opposition. I'm not going to go over them, but I've already said the heart of them is the classic problem of the regress of justification. So, how on earth does that fit with the method of opposition as I've just described it? It's quite patent that Sextus does traffic in general skeptical arguments. So how can I say that Pyrrhonism is practical all the way down? Well, this way. Sextus only employs those arguments reactively. And the thought is this. If you've been frustrated by a skeptic who constantly argues with you at first order, you develop your view of democracy and atomism, and then he says, well, wait a minute, let me give you a nice presentation of Empedocles on the and you think, wow, that's probably equally plausible, and then you don't know what to think. And then you move on to some other topic, and he does the same thing again. And so on and so on. If you're constantly frustrated, either with an interlocutor or even yourself, and it's really yourself that Sextus is concerned with, it's natural to seek an escape from your frustration at first order by going epistemological, say, what we really need here is a better understanding of knowledge and justification. We're not getting anywhere at first order, because it seems that for any first order claim, an incompatible first order claim can be elaborated with roughly equal plausibility. So what we've got to do is turn to epistemology, and that's why Sextus says, I even accept provisionally the Stoic claim that in the order of philosophy, the three divisions of philosophy of logic, which includes what we would call epistemology, physics, and ethics, logic comes first. Because after all, if we're going to seek the truth, we'd better have some idea about what the truth, what truth is and how we seek it. And you can see how someone who'd been, as it were, frustrated by an oppositional skeptic might think that was the way to go. But that's where skeptical arguments come in. Skeptical arguments, I believe, in Pyrrhonian skepticism, stand in the way of systematic epistemology. I mean, the skepticism about first-order claims rooted in the method of opposition stands on its own 2 feet. What the elaboration of skeptical argumentation blocks is escape from first-order frustration by going epistemological. Now, Sextus does not claim, and I think quite explicitly tells you in some later writings, he does not need to draw a skeptical conclusion to make this point. Sextus concedes that it's very natural to think there must be a criterion of knowledge, a way to get it. There must be a way to defend the idea that some people's opinions are far more to be trusted than others. Sextus doesn't deny that we have a strong inclination to think that. But he also thinks, properly elaborated, we have a strong inclination to think that skeptical arguments are irrefutable. And so far from grounding the method of opposition, which is what most readers of Sextus think, the epistemological arguments apply the method to epistemology. So Pyrrhonian skepticism is not a consequence of epistemic theorizing, as is the skepticism of the first meditation. It's an application of it's a special application of oppositional skepticism to the very epistemological enterprise itself. So as I put it here, the Pyrrhonist method isn't derived from epistemological considerations, it applies to them. So there's a sense in which Sextus is not an epistemological skeptic. He's a skeptic about epistemology, along with everything else that he's a skeptic about. He's a skeptic about epistemology in just the way that he's a skeptic in physics, or a skeptic in ethics, or a skeptic in grammar, or indeed in any form of theoretical inquiry. Now, I won't talk about the practical aspect. I think it's pretty clear, though, that this structural context does explain quite a few of the differences we've seen between Pyrrhonian and Cartesian skepticism. It's just not the standard model. So Descartes' epistemic focus, his aim to take in everything all at once, needs a modally strong form of skepticism, needs a principal form of skepticism, needs to follow the standard model, needs an asserted skeptical doctrine, and you can get all those things out of it. I mean, I leave that to some degree as an exercise to the reader of the handout to see how much you can get out of that. But I don't think you can get everything out of it. And I really don't think it's the whole story. One thing is, after all, it's not as if the Pyrrhonians, if I'm right, the Pyrrhonian skeptic is a bit of an epistemological opportunist. Since he doesn't mean to inculcate a skeptical doctrine, any skeptical problem's good for him, somebody comes up claiming to know something or other, or, we know through the senses. After all, why not deploy the argument of the first meditation to question that as Descartes does, Of course, he won't go on to say, if Descartes said, having disposed the senses, we can now argue that reason is the source of knowledge, the Pyrrhonian's got to have to go on and say, that's not such an obviously live option. But there's nothing that methodologically prevents the Pyrrhonian skeptic from exploiting Cartesian considerations in his own special way. He wouldn't exploit them quite the way Descartes did, but he could exploit them in his own way of exploiting them. But he doesn't. They don't think of them. And this is where I think there must be some profound difference in content between the two forms of skepticism. Indeed, there is. Well, let me say very briefly what I think it is. I think that, a lot of philosophers today want to make skepticism, Cartesian skepticism, appear to be what I call intuitive. That's to say, to follow from just the most everyday, banal considerations about knowledge, or knowledge of the world, or perception. My view has long been, as some of you read some of my previous writings, has been that this is simply not so. The Cartesian skepticism is wholly an artifact of the special version of the representational theory of mind that Descartes inculcates. And this theory, I think, has two features which are utterly essential. Descartes thinks that, first of all, thought is, several features. Thought involves the presence of the mind of what he calls ideas. That's a blanket term that Descartes uses to cover what we might call concepts. The idea of a horse, the idea of a golden mountain. Judgments, which involve assemblage of ideas. The idea that there is a golden mountain in Peru or something like that, but ideas for Descartes have two features, I think. First of all, their representational properties, their intentionality, their aboutness is intrinsic to them. It's intrinsic to them. It's not in any way explained. And Descartes is not alone in this. You sometimes find yourself wondering what the 17th century philosophers meant by idea, and if you turn to the first page of the Port Royal Logic, you find them saying, some terms are so simple and clear that to attempt to explain them would be pointless. Such a term is idea, and the historian of philosophy thinks, this is not very helpful, I was hoping for more than that, but you don't get it. But they're intrinsically intentional. Come back to that. The second thing is that they themselves, of course, however, as representations of other things, on pain of infinite regress, are themselves known without representation. And that's what immediately means. They are immediate. They are known to the mind, but they are known without representational intermediates. Obviously, they have to be, because if you needed an idea of an idea to be aware of an idea, then you need an idea of an idea of an idea, and you can't have that. So ideas are known, the contents of the mind, the contents of thought, are known by mere presence to consciousness. And Descartes thinks that where there is no representation, there can be no misrepresentation. And consequently, things known immediately are known perfectly, or, as we say, incorrigibly. Now, I won't have time now to go into why he thinks this. Descartes develops this theory essentially in an attempt to make to create a more hospitable intellectual environment for the new mathematical physics than was provided by Aristotelian scholasticism, with what he thought was a kind of naive empiricism, particularly a naive conceptual empiricism built into it, the idea that all ideas come to us in the end through the senses. As we know, Descartes doesn't think this. He thinks we have innate ideas. He also thinks that true knowledge, true understanding, is to be wholly distinguished from the kind that from sensory representation, which for Descartes is imagistic. And it's very important, of course, nothing original about this, but it is important never to forget it. Descartes was a pioneer of analytic geometry, and y equals nx plus c doesn't immediately remind the uninitiated of a line. Under the spell of the senses, we're very apt to think that things we can imagine, form mental pictures of, are much better understood. But Descartes, of course, thinks that representing a geometrical object algebraically as a set of points satisfying an equation gives far more information and is far more effective in generating correct inferences than anything that involves picturing in the mind's eye. And Descartes himself, one of his early great discoveries, of course, was that certain problems about intersecting lines, which were insoluble by geometrical methods available to the Greeks, once you've got the lines represented algebraically, simply reduce to the problem of solving a bunch of simultaneous equations. Like the Greeks had no idea how to do that. And Descartes' famous Discourse on Method, of course, was written as an introduction to a volume in which the geometry was the first substantive essay. Okay, now it's okay. So the problem is that, though, once you've got this idea, it's this idea. It's not strictly just the idea that inner states are representational, of course, that generates the problem. It's that they themselves are objects of knowledge, are presented non-representationally. It's the combination, and also of intrinsic intent. I mean, there's two ideas. I think it's really important to see that you need both of these. A good deal of modern philosophy of language does not think that the semantic properties of inner states can be explained independently of our capacity to interact with objects in the environment. So intentionality is in that sense not intrinsic. It has to be understood, at least in part, in the context of extrinsic relations to things around us. You see this, for example, in Davison's interpretationist approach to meaning or something like that. Descartes' idea of intrinsic intentionality, though, allows, as it were, the representational properties of ideas to swing free of environmental considerations. The fact that they're themselves then incorrigibly known establishes their intrinsic epistemic privilege, however. I mean, they have, so to say, semantic independence and epistemic privilege. And it's those two things that makes them a screen between mind and world. And it's putting that screen in the way that generates the problem of the external world. And the reason, then, the Greeks skeptics never had the problem of the external world is they didn't have the concept of the external world. They didn't have the concept of the external world because they didn't draw the mind-world boundary where Descartes draws it. They particularly didn't do so because, and here's a further feature of the Cartesian mind I haven't mentioned, Descartes treats what he calls ideas of sensation as if they were already conceptual. So perceptual states, conceptual states, all the same, intrinsically representational, immediately known, but possibly not corresponding to anything. No Greek philosopher by knowledge, except possibly the Cyrenaics, but they didn't leave any writings extant to us, so we don't really know for sure, really thought of the mind that way, because for them sensation straddled the boundary between, so to say, internal representation and embodiment. For the Greek, when the Greeks like Skeptics talk about knowledge of external objects, they mean in the vicinity, in your surroundings. After Descartes, external means without the mind. Without the mind, when the ancient concept of sensation has been split cleanly into the conscious representation of the physiological substrate, which are now conceptually wholly independent, as Descartes argues later in the Meditations. So, the world, for all we immediately know, just might not be there. And skepticism goes existential. Well, in the last few minutes, that's a horribly quick and crude sketch of an incredibly subtle view. But let me say how I think Descartes introduces this view. I said that we often treat this problem as very immediate and obvious. I don't think it's that immediate and obvious, by the way. And I think I mentioned popular culture. I think one of the ways in which you can see the problem is itself more of a problem, is that most films based on Cartesian skepticism are actually incoherent. I mean, think of The Matrix, okay? Everybody remember G.E. Moore, right, when he holds up his hand and proves the external world. Here is one hand, here is another, so at least two external objects are known to exist. These films all have what I call the Moorean moment. Having developed a world in which you couldn't possibly know what's going on, you then get to drink a blue liquid. And then you get dropped into a bath of cold water. And all of a sudden, the scales, as it were, the representations fall from your mind, so to say. And, Keanu Reeves now knows he's no longer a battery, but he's merely swimming in cold water, beneath the place where he used to be a battery. Why this isn't just one further clever move in the simulation is never explained. And it's never explained because the story can't move forward if that problem would be taken seriously. I mean, if you really buy the Cartesian picture of the relation of mind to world, then you can't drink a blue liquid and suddenly know what's going on. I think this is true of all these films. They develop the problem, so-called, and then what they give with the one hand, they take back with the other. All of a sudden, if you just get in the right frame of mind or take the right drugs, hey, the external world is immediately available. Well, that may be a dramatic necessity, but in my view, it's a philosophical incoherence, and we ought to learn something from that. Well, so how does he do this? Well, I think Descartes actually, in the course of developing the arguments of the first meditation, is actually introducing us to the theoretical ideas that underpin the argument. Something that's often forgotten. The argument seems so easy to us now, living 300 years later, fully familiar with Cartesian ideas. It's easy to forget that it didn't seem obvious to Descartes' contemporaries. And if you read the objections to the first meditation, Hobbes and Gassendi, who are hardly unintelligent people, were mystified by the skepticism of the first meditation. Hobbes simply didn't see that it was different from the old-fashioned appeals to conflicting experiences which you could read in Sextus and which had been revivified by Montaigne. He just didn't see the difference. It's a pity that our author, so distinguished in modern speculations, did not spare us this old rubbish, says Hobbes in his comments on Descartes. Gassendi says, oh, well, look, you can tell her things without us outside, because if there weren't, nothing would cause us to have these ideas. By the third meditation, Gassendi says, oh, wait a minute, you're saying that I might have the ideas even without those things that give rise to them. And then maybe I wouldn't know whether there were such things. Oh, in other words, it's only when Gassendi has got much further into the meditations and begun to familiarize himself with the Cartesian outlook that the initial problem finally starts to make sense to him. Well, I think that the pivot is the dream argument, of course. I think that's how Descartes does it. So I'll just move now very briefly to the last part of my talk, and I'll explain the little table that you see on the back. Okay, here's dreaming in Sextus. This is all. This is one brief passage in the fourth mode of suspension from the 10 modes of Anisodemus. Sextus. Different appearances come about depending on sleeping and waking. When we are awake, we view things differently from the way we do when we are asleep, and when asleep, differently from the way we do when awake. So the existence or non-existence of the objects becomes not absolute, but relative to being asleep or awake. It's likely, then, that when asleep, we see things which are unreal in waking life. Not unreal once and for all, for they exist in sleep, just as the contexts of waking life exist, though they do not exist in sleep. Very briefly, I think this argument attributes, this contrasts, as it were, the dream state with the waking state, but there are 5 features. Okay. The first is what I call our current persuasive equivalence. According to Sextus, dreams are as persuasive to the dreamer as waking experiences to the person awake. At the time. Okay. At the time. So, a current persuasive equivalence. Dreams are, I'm not saying this is true, but it's Sextus's view. So, as he puts it, we assent to what is present in the present. The second is cognitive lucidity. There's no suggestion in Sextus that the dream state is a non-lucid state. You're just as compos mentis, so to say, thinking just as clearly, at least potentially, when you're dreaming, as you are when you're awake. You're just thinking different things, like, oh my God, I'm being, chased by a monster, or, I'm back having this argument with my late mother, or something of the sort. The dream state is not treated as a confused state, for example, where no question of knowledge would arise because, as it were, coherent. I mean, you might think that in dreaming you're no more really thinking thoughts than you are riding a bicycle. I mean, you dream that you think lucid thoughts, but you're not thinking them. You can dream that you ride a bicycle, but you're not riding one, and that would be another view, but that's not Sextus's view. And it's quite interesting that Sextus associates dreaming is just one of many states, discrepant states mentioned in the fourth mode. The others are youth and age. There's no suggestion in Sextus that young people are not lucid or that old people are not lucid. It's just that young people and old people tend to do things rather differently, and according to Sextus there's no special way of, there's no reason to privilege one perspective over the other. So dreaming just becomes one more state, as lucid as the waking state, but no ultimate reason to give the waking state the palm in terms of revealing reality. A state awareness symmetry is the third feature, I call it. I just roughly mean this: when you're awake, you know you're awake. When you're dreaming, you know you're dreaming. Sextus never asked, how do I know I'm dreaming? Might I be awake right now? He seems to think that dreamers know, in some sense, this is a different state of mind to be in. And waking people know this is a different state of mind. The states are different. The question is, which is the guide to reality, but not how do I know I'm in one rather than the other, which is the Cartesian question. And I think that's connected with the fourth feature, which is content discrepancy. Sextus argues that the dream world is different in its content from the waking world. You know, different things happen in dreams. The things that happen in dreams typically don't happen in waking life, Sextus says. And then the fifth is ontological neutrality. I mean, hey, there's the dream world, there's the waking world. Each presents itself as real. Who knows? Now, if we go to Cicero, we get something rather different. Here's Cicero on dreaming. As if anyone would deny that a man who's woken up thinks that he's been dreaming, or that one whose madness has subsided thinks that the things that he saw during his madness were not true. But that's not the point at issue. What we're asking is what these things looked like at the time when they were seen. Now, so we see right away, actually, Sextus thinks that there is an important epistemic asymmetry between the dream state and the waking state. You might be fooled at the time, but the fact is, once you're lucid, once you wake up, then you realise you've been dreaming. So when you're awake, you know for sure you're awake. When you're dreaming, you might not know whether you're dreaming. So there's actually an important epistemic asymmetry between the dreaming state and the waking state, according to Cicero. And I think that's a fairly common sense view. It's a view we can find in Austin. Why would we have the word a phrase, a dream-like quality, says Austin, in sensibility, if there were really an issue here. But I think the most interesting thing in Cicero is what he associates dreaming with. He associates it with drunkenness and madness. That's to say, he associates dreaming with states that are not cognitively lucid, that are to some degree delusional. Not merely where you're in the sense that you're thinking false thoughts, but you're not thinking straight in the dream case, according to Cicero. Now, I think this leads to a very important distinction. Cicero, in fact, deriving, I assume, from academic materials, has two quite different sorts of indistinguishability arguments. The one is where, at the time, since you're not thinking straight, you can't tell the state of being dreaming or being insane or being drunk from being awake, sane, and or sober. So that's one indistinguishability argument. You can't, at the time, always tell what state you're in. And that's because of the epistemic asymmetry between the states that I called attention to earlier. Now, in these states, you may, quote, see things that don't exist. The drunkard's famous pink rats, or, the madman's, hallucinations, or whatever. But Cicero's point is, not that you're actually, this is different from Sextus. Sextus thinks you're aware of objects in the both cases. Dream objects, waking objects. Cicero's view is no. There's a sense in which you're not presented with objects in the bad case. There's nothing there. The drunkard's rats aren't there. Your problem is you can't distinguish between seeing and seeming to see. That's the dream problem, or that's the drunkenness problem. Now, what about, though, note, these are contentfully discrepant states. You don't normally see pink rats running along the end of the bed, right? But when you're drunk, you can't tell whether you're actually seeing such things or merely seeming to see them. So he accepts content discrepancy. Strange things happen in dreams, but he does add to Sextus epistemic asymmetry, and then says, in the bad states, we may not be able to tell what state we're in. That's the academic argument. Now, he has, however, a wholly separate kind of indistinguishability argument, where the states are content convergent. Where there's no question you're in a lucid state. You're seeing, but you can't tell what you're seeing. Well, what states are those? Two eggs. I show you two eggs. I say, egg A, egg B. Gotta go like this. If I say, egg A, egg B. But are you sure? Nothing so like as eggs. Or, I see Gaius. He has a twin, Titus. Maybe I know about Titus, maybe I don't. But I don't know that I'm seeing Gaius, because if I was seeing Titus, I'd still think I was seeing Gaius. I can't tell Gaius from Titus. Why? Because nobody can tell Gaius from Titus. They look exactly the same. They're doppelgangers. So Cicero does have an argument in which, as it were, the experiences can be, as it were, identical in content. The experience of seeing Gaius is just like the experience of seeing Titus. But that's because Gaius is just like Titus. In other words, experiences that are content indistinguishable, according to Cicero, derive from indistinguishable objects. Well, you can see what's coming. Descartes essentially fuses the two academic arguments into a wholly new form. Descartes takes Sextus's idea. Descartes, first of all, takes Sextus's idea that dreaming and the bad states, like dreaming, demon deception, are cognitively lucid. He does this, by the way, without argument. He raises the skeptical hypothesis that he might be mad in the first meditation, and says he would be mad to consider it. He gives you no reason why considering the possibility that he's mad is somehow more outrageous or outlandish than considering the possibility that God or the evil deceiver is totally manipulating his experience. I would actually find it pretty difficult to say which was the more outlandish on the outlandishness scale. I'm inclined to think the theological version is the more outlandish on the outlandish. I think the evil deceiver is worse than the thought that I might be crazy. If I had to choose. But the point of that, I think, in Descartes, is to imply, without ever explicitly arguing, that the next case he's going to consider, the dream case, is a case of cognitively lucid experience. Madness has already been existing. So, as it were, we've got cognitive lucidity in the both cases. But we've now also got state awareness symmetry in a new form. You can't tell which state you're in. That's like Cicero on dreaming and drunkenness. But notice, you can't tell what state you're in, but with the proviso that you're cognitively lucid in both states, which Cicero does not make. And then in the third case, the third feature of the Cartesian dreaming argument is, you now, against the background and partly introducing intrinsic intentionality and epistemic privilege for inner representations, you now diverge from Sextus in replacing Sextus's content discrepancy between dreams and waking with potential content identity. Dreams can simply replicate the content of waking experience. Now, that's a wholly new configuration of skeptical eye. That's nowhere in the ancients. But what you've done, notice, by moving content convergence into the dream argument, these are considerations that Cicero keeps separately, you've begun to detach the capacity of experiences in good states and bad states to be content identical from causation by identical objects. Dream states are internally aroused. There's no question of Gaius whom you can't tell from Titus. On the contrary, they're internally aroused or divinely inspired as much as the dreams or the delusions of the drunk or the madman. No objects necessary, but at the same time, unlike in Cicero, the bad state, dreaming, or demon delusion, can replicate the good state, ordinary experience, but now without tying it to being aroused by indistinguishable objects in the environment. All the demon does is radicalize this by saying, well, maybe actually there wouldn't even need to be the brain to internally arouse them. Descartes essentially softens you up for this idea of experience as, so to say, conceptually representative but fully detachable, both, as it were, epistemically and semantically, from any sort of interaction with the world around you. You don't see that this full Cartesian bag of tricks is already... I mean, as I said in The Natural Doubts, Descartes appears later on to pull these ideas out of his skeptical investigation. In my view, he does it in exactly the same way that the conjurer pulls the rabbit out of the hat. He stuffed the rabbit in the hat when you weren't looking. And the first meditation is, I think, the most brilliant exercise in hat stuffing in the history of philosophy. The rabbit of the Cartesian mind is stuffed into the hat of the Cartesian skeptical argument, and then later on triumphantly pulled out as part of the solution. Well, there's a little table there that gives you the differences in the dreaming arguments. But I think, in fact, this conception of mind that Descartes introduces and on which his skeptical arguments fully depend is a radically new conception of subjectivity without counterpart, at least in the ancient skeptical tradition, certainly not in Aristotle or Plato. And in brief, and as long as you work, I believe, within the parameters that it sets, the problem will never admit of satisfactory solution. And the same goes for its comrade in arms for mind-body problem, of course, which is the other side of this particular coin. So I want to say, Hegel was right. Thank you.